my life. Hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, October 9th, 2021. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today we continue with our webinar in Phase 11. It's the 58th overall in our series of webinars on the topic, comparing and contrasting the true teachings of Jesus with the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity. This is topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Neil Waldrop is the author and also the chairman of the committee, to whom I am turning this webinar to now. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. I am once again delighted to be here and to be with all of you. We are continuing our series in examining the period of monasticism that lasted from approximately the year 300 to approximately the year 1500. And in particular, we are now going to talk about a feature of observance by women that is quite interesting. For those of you who have been following our series, you will understand that we are currently using a document containing questions on monasticism. If you are not among those who have been following it, or at least do not have that document in front of you, I recommend that you download it from the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Here is the citation: www.globalendeavor.net. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. In this citation, the word global endeavor is treated as if it were a single word with no space or punctuation in the middle. The link you are looking for is called Questions on Monasticism, and it's about 2/3 of the way down the homepage. Now, the discussion that we are having and have been having for quite some time about monasticism is a branch off from the overall discussion of the long document Revelation Revealed. A link to Revelation Revealed is also available on the same homepage, but that document contains only one paragraph on monasticism that we have already discussed. So you will not need the document for our discussion today, but of course you are entirely free to download it if you would like to do that. Now, because you cannot ask us a question as we are going along, we offer you the opportunity to send us in a question or two by email. If you wish to do that, you would use the email address at the bottom of the page, which is very simple: info@globalendeavor.net. If we decide to use your question in a future program, we reserve the right to edit the wording. And in that case, you will get an answer from everyone participating in the discussion that day, not just from me personally. So now, having gone through all the procedural details, I would like to turn to the subject of our discussion today pertaining to women believers in this period that we are discussing. This topic specifically is on page 28 of the document containing questions on monasticism. And I would ask Bob to put it on the screen for us, please. So, and as a contrast to the material that we discussed last week, in which effectively there were limitations imposed on women very strenuously by the men who were running male monasteries, This particular feature involves considerably more leeway and opportunity for women than was the case of the previous pattern. It is called beguines, a French word, and I have discussed with my colleagues that we can pronounce it that way and be reasonably correct. So I will start by reading the heading and the first paragraph of text, and then I wonder if I could call on Francois to read the quotation paragraph that follows the heading material. Is that okay, Francois? You can just nod. All right, here we go. The Beguines, an urban experiment with feminine characteristics. The historian Gert Melville describes a strong movement focusing on pious women that emerged in the final years of the 12th century. He states that the movement's focal point was, quote, the vibrant urban environment of the Low Countries and the Rhineland, unquote, but adds that, quote, it spread from there to northern France and along the Rhine down to Switzerland, unquote.
In the first half of the 13th century, in many places, a form of community life emerged in which the beguines lived together under the direction of a mistress, magistrat. In this case, too, they renounced lifelong vows with the result that they could leave the community to marry, for example, though they had to leave behind the property they had brought when they joined. In a few houses of beguines, the women embraced manual labor to support themselves, for example, in textile work, and devoted themselves, in addition to religious exercises and prayer, to charitable work such as care for the sick and dying and care for the homeless and the poor. In its outward form, their pattern of life thus already had a strong affinity to the world of the monastery, and their houses were not infrequently tied, though without vows, to religious life, for example, to the Cistercian order. They also often assimilated themselves to the mendicant orders by way of the pastoral care offered through those communities.
Thank you, Francois. As a brief introduction to the discussion of this paragraph, I would comment that it seems to indicate a kind of do-it-yourself exercise in which women were following their own inclinations in ways that were suitable and convenient for them, expressing a religious dedication and commitment in the social context that was possible for them at the time. I wonder, Doreen, whether there are other attributes of this that you would like to comment on or elaborate on?
Okay. Thank you, Neil. So you're asking me about that time, what else did they do? What?
No, I'm asking you for your general impression of the methods that they were using and the arrangement that they had produced as described in this paragraph.
Well, first of all, if they followed the order of the monks and nuns from the rule of St. Benedict, so that was the rule that they did manual labor, they were self-sufficient, and they didn't leave the monastery. But that was, in a different time period than what happened afterwards with the Franciscans and the Dominicans. And what happened with the women, they went out to the public and they helped the poor and they offered salvation. And they preached and they heard confessions and they met people's needs. And this was very effective at that time. So as a result, and that was, they said 1198 to 1216. So all these names, the Cluniacs and all that stuff, I had to look up because I am not familiar with that. So anyway, so the Cistercians, they So they dominated, they said, the 12th century. They own nothing, they begged for food, and they lived the apostolic life, right? I don't know how far you want me to go with this, so.
I wanted you to give me your general impression, and I think you answered at least my initial inquiry. I wonder, Gary, if in effect this description of their voluntary efforts without taking vows strikes you as an improvement over the general monastic system of a monastery, which was quite rigid. Gary, you're not able to speak unless you unmute yourself.
Okay. You could have had a course in lip reading then, but you didn't take it. Coming off from what Doreen said, this was a revelation in what these women were doing, because they actually broke out from the nunnery, the monastic life, the nunnery, and they went out into the wide world. And with the Franciscans and the Dominicans, they then helped the poor and the needy, and they attended to them. And this was a revelation as to what they were doing before. Well, they were in the nunneries, and people had to come to visit them if they wanted anything of use for them, any midwifery or whatever. But now they have gone out into the poverty-stricken places that were in the Middle Ages.
I think you have highlighted an important point that the author describes about the service and care for the homeless and the poor. But even so, they had a group home. They lived together in a group context, and then use that group context as a vehicle for going out into the community. Is that your understanding also?
Yes, I totally. And I think, as we alluded to last week, that when you go out in these on your own there, it's like today, you could get molested, you get attacked, and they went out in these groups. But also, I would believe that the people they were tending to, they were protected. They would protect these groups of women, the beginnings, because they wanted to have a facility from them. They wanted to have the health care. They wanted to be tended to, and they didn't want them being upset. So I believe that, they came in groups, and that's how they multiplied. That's how they got stronger. But if they went out initially, and they may have done on their own, and they found that it was counterproductive, and they couldn't do anything. And, even today, when somebody does a job of work, you usually have two people there, the minimum two people, just in case something goes wrong. But in those days they were in groups, and they were well thought of. As I said, it was a revelation to what was happening in the past centuries.
Thank you, Gary. Bob, I would like to probe a phrase in the second sentence of the paragraph that Francois read that is a bit unusual in the way the author states it. He states, in this case, too, they renounced lifelong vows. Well, to me, renouncing has to do with a vow that you're going away from. But in this case, it means they renounced the practice of making lifelong vows. In other words, they did not make vows. Now, why was this important, and why was that an advantage for them?
Well, go back to what you called it. You called it a do-it-yourself program. The way that they started was quite interesting. I read an article about from Professor Carol Neal here. It's called "The Origin of the Beguines," and you can go all the way back to the Desert Fathers in the 3rd and 4th century, and there were Desert Mothers, and in fact there was always seemed to be an interstitial parallel movement of women that were mimicking or at least attempted in that particular society, in those, I should say, societies, because they changed over time. So I like to use the word hybrid, because what Professor Neal says is she points out two things, and she says that the two features were chastity and extra regular. I think it's the extra regular part of this renouncing that took them away from the monastic constraints, so to speak. And of course, they stayed within the communities, so they were part of the community. They were extra regular, meaning that they didn't vow to the regula, to the rules, so to speak, of monastic life, but yet they were, and by all accounts, all of the historians call them pious. You can put whatever definition you want to the term pious. So to me, this is a hybrid group of individuals, all women, supported in some ways by men periodically, which is probably why it crashed in the 16th century or so. Although in many of the towns in Belgium, many of these houses actually still exist. There was an article in the New York Times that I found from 2006 with, it was an opinion article, and it was religious area, I guess, at the Times at the time. And it was a long article about this reporter who had gone to Antwerp and had spent some time in Brussels. I'm sorry, in Brussels also, and was explaining what she found about these. Some were dilapidated, some were preserved, some were almost museums. So it was a pretty interesting, and I think that there's a term that comes up a little later, and I think what we're going to read here, and it's either Lawrence or one of the two historians that you gave here, say that it's a very interesting study. So a little long-winded there about the fact that I think I would call them a hybrid. There's the two features, chastity and the fact that they're extra regular, and they sit in between. They're both inside and outside of the society itself. So I find all of this pretty interesting, and as we get talking a little bit more about it, I'll apply my hypotheses to it. Back over.
Thank you. I would like to pursue with Francois the idea of hybrid that you've used, or I called it do it yourself. Is this psychologically attuned to what might be considered feminine perspectives for flexibility and adaptability? Do you see something here that is particularly female? We started the heading feminine characteristics. So have the women designed a format that is less rigid and more convenient for their own purposes? And is this an example of originality in your view?
Yes, it was a revolution and very something, and genuinely feminine. So for the first time, a large number of women can decide with their free will to go in this way. Because before that, I read they were offered to a monastery till 7 years old. There was a child, and it was not a free will decision. Now they can choose to choose this way of life, and for the good reason. Surely there's some the women that chose this life for many reasons, but it offered an opportunity for the good reasons that are a call of the inner life, and they can do that. It's not a parking for parking for unmarriable women. It would not be necessary to take care of the poor and the sick and everything. It's a choice.
So you're right. This
Really
is
an
not,
improvement.
this is not a retreat from the world. This is, in fact, a group context that enables these pious women to interact with the world. Am I accurate in that?
Yes, I agree
Do
with
you think that psychologically it was important to them that they were doing this of their own volition and from their own perspective instead of following orders from men? Was that important?
Yeah, it was a objective sign of emancipation, in my
Okay,
view.
good. Thank you. I will read the intervening
Doreen
line of
want to
introduction.
talk.
I'm sorry, do you have additional thoughts, Francois? I didn't mean to cut you off.
Doreen wanted to talk to.
Oh, Doreen
Something.
volunteered to come back in. I didn't see her hand. That's fine. Go ahead, Doreen.
You didn't see me come in anyway. So they said, just like you just mentioned, they were very pious. That's correct. But because they were pious, the church targeted them. And they didn't like the idea of their independence. So, but unlike the nuns, of course, that took their vows, the beguines lived without the male oversight, which the clerics then started to call them names. So you're talking about, you know, the female independence, where they're able to express their true longing to do, you know, the Jesusonian idea of what their religious life should be about, threaten the males, the monks. So the clerics then enabled them. I mean, it was really interesting. Heretics, prostitutes, beggars, and lesbians. And they really, and then this created conflict because then the women were really upset. But I just wanted to get that point across, that even though they were wonderful, pious women, and they did exactly what, you know, they were led to do by the Spirit, which of course Jesus' teachings were, this was a terrible disservice to the, you know, to the males.
Well, some of the men felt it was. We're going to elaborate on this in a paragraph at the bottom of the next page, which confirms a great deal of what you have just said. We will discuss it in greater depth, however, when we reach that paragraph.
Okay, good.
I would like to proceed to the next segment. I will read the two lines about the historian C.H. Lawrence, and then I would ask Bob to proceed with the paragraph that begins with the word that begins like the Cistercian nuns. What happened to the image, Bob? It's not on the screen. Can you put the page on the screen, please?
It should be there.
What I see is your notepad. I'm sorry, your
I had the wrong screen up. Sorry about that.
okay, there we are, fine. So here is the very short introductory remarks that I will read. The historian C.H. Lawrence supplies considerably more detail, partly by analyzing the movement from social and psychological perspective. And then Bob, if you could continue, but just that first paragraph.
Okay. The Beguines, like the Cistercian nuns, were a product of the extraordinary spirit of religious fervor that swept through the certain sections of Western society in the 12th and 13th centuries. They were groups of laywomen living in the towns of Northern Europe and in some rural areas of Swabia, who came together to practice a new form of religious life. They were not affiliated to any religious order, nor did they follow any recognized monastic rule. The movement probably owed its recruits to the social exclusiveness of the nunneries. Possibly it represented a conscious and widespread rejection of the affluent image and formalism of the established orders. But there was more to it than this. Its piety was rooted in the cult of voluntary poverty and the current ideas of the apostolic life, but it flowered in a very different soil. In Northern Europe, it was an urban phenomenon.
Urban phenomenon. Thank you. What do you take from one of these sentences that you read? Possibly it represented a conscious and widespread rejection of the affluent image and formalism of the established orders. Is that simply a comment about male monasteries, or does it also pertain to the traditional kind of female convent, or otherwise known as a nunnery?
I'll take it down. So I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you repeat the question?
What is the sentence implying? What is this that the women were implicitly rejecting? The historian uses two phrases, affluent image and then formalism in relation to the previous methods of monasteries and nunneries.
Well, sure. What we learned last week and what we discussed at length is that the nunneries, and especially starting in the 6th and 7th century, were pretty much established because of the aristocratic society that was able to provide funding and resources to be able to preserve it. And of course, the monastery that supported that like that also. This has always been an economic event. If you look, we've discussed this at length for the last bunch of webinars, and that essentially that's what kept one of the major vectors, I suppose, is to keeping the church fully afloat, and to keeping the monasteries also fully afloat was the economic part of it. Not only did the monasteries preserve their own formal way of being able to produce revenue. We haven't talked a lot about that, of course. Well, there's some discussion about capitalism at some point. At least one of the historians feels that the monasteries were, an important vector in establishing capitalism. But the point I'm trying to make here is that, sure, there's this image that it's just for the affluent. If you come from an aristocratic family, and according to what we read last week, is that if the women were having difficulty getting married, and I find that a little bit interesting, to be honest with you. We didn't really discuss why is that the case in this society. But it has to do with being able to use this dowry mechanism that was used to keep the money at the established levels in the gentry area. So that's the image that's there, and of course the formalism is, both of these things are going to be rejected. So what these women are doing, or what this whole movement started, was to say, look, okay, I really understand the chastity part of it, and we're going to stay with that, because almost seems as though the women are almost saying the same thing as men. It's that, childbirth is pretty rough, and you guys don't help out a lot. So, we're going to stay chaste. We like that idea, but we're not aristocrats, and we don't have all of this dowry money. And what's the other one? We're just not going to. We're more interested in personal religion, I think, and I think that was the real catalyst that drove this large assemblage of females that were able to get together and live in communities. It's a very powerful thing. Jesus taught that, during the ordination ceremony, where that's where he laid down. This is a personal religion. This is I'm going to come in contact with, or conflict, I should say, with all of the established order in the Jewry, and we're going to have some problems. But I'm delivering to you a personal religion because it's going to be able to set society in in the spiritual direction that it needs to go. So that's how I see that sentence there.
Okay, that's very helpful. I think we have a variety of elements here, partly from the preceding paragraph, that there was a magistra, there was a mistress who was in charge, but the participants in the beginnage did not take vows. And the other paragraph stated that they could leave. They were able to leave if something else came up, if, for example, a marriage was arranged for them. So it was not exactly a transient circumstance, but one which could be varied in ways that were suitable to the woman concerned at the time, not operating under a vow of strict obedience, for example, as was true of the monks and the nuns in the traditional framework, such as applied to the Benedictines and the Cistercians. I wonder whether the point has to do with voluntary poverty and the ideas of the apostolic life. Is this an appealing image psychologically? Gary, could you comment on that?
Okay. Yeah, I think that I believe that going back to what Bob says about a catalyst, what was the driving force for them? And on the piety part of it, it was the reverence for God. It was devout fulfillment of religious obligations. To me, that was their driving force. They were given this opportunity, but behind that opportunity were the teachings of Jesus. Was the fulfillment of God's obligations to help the poor, to help the needy. On the poverty side of that, that's what they found. That's where they found the various people who needed help, not in the monastic life or the monasteries or the nunneries. It was out there in the open, and they'd been there for centuries, and nobody attended to them. I would have thought that maybe the shamans, but that's another subject. So from my point of view there, in a nutshell, is that they had a reverence for God. They were doing it on his behalf and an obligation.
I think this is a very important point psychologically. The reverence for God included a desire to minister to others in the community. It was not simply sitting in the chapel of a monastery or a nunnery and chanting prayers. Instead, they were actually serving people in society. And I wonder if this idea of reaching out to others is actually a new thing in the religious performance, religious ministry of that day. Francois, would you say that this is in effect moving away from an exclusive and inward idea that God's blessing comes from those who separate themselves from society and live in a cloistered environment? Is that something that is implicitly being not only rejected, but also perhaps transcended?
Yes, I agree with you, Neil. And the reject is not just of a formalism, it's the reject of what prevent them to do their life as they want. In a spiritual perspective, you have human beings with a thought adjuster, and the spirit of truth is there, and they want to make their life following their appeal. And there's a lot of obstacles that, and now it's more open. They can do their lives the way they want to do collectively. And one thing that struck me a little bit is feminine aspect of religion, to serve and not judging, and the male counterpart that's more evangelizing. And I saw some similarities with the global endeavor that we want to and the seraphim aspect, the seraphim feminine aspect. They want, there's a lot of things to do there to help people, and we're gonna help the sick, the poor. We take care of people. We let the evangelization to to friars, but no, it's something original in those times.
Thank you. So part of what you said, I think, confirms my insight or my theory that this was specifically different from reciting stereotype prayers, which was the central feature of life in a traditional monastery or nunnery, whereby the monks or nuns in a traditional nunnery would gather together and recite the Psalms or the other holy prayers. So this was their main activity, whereas the Beguinages and the Beguines as people were actually doing things for others. They were not simply chanting prayers.
And it's why the urban life was a good place for that, to favor this kind of function.
Thank you. Does anyone else want, I'm sorry, did you signal that you'd like to add something, Bob?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Just one thought, because I was, I sort of alluded to the ordination paper that's that's in the Revelation, and you asked something about the wealth part of it, and there is a difference between apostleship and discipleship. Discipleship being brotherhood, and apostleship, being fatherhood. And in fact, Jesus gives in that paper 140, Jesus gives the 8 Beatitudes that show up in the Bible, of course, and the great explanation, which is in the Revelation, is those. The first 4 were for brotherhood, and the last 4 were for the fatherhood. So there's an interesting pattern there. But the point I wanted to make is that, there was these aberrations of the gospel of Jesus over the centuries, of course. And the one thing that shows up in paper 140 is the section on section 8, Thursday afternoon on the lake. This is after the ordination, and he's already done the Beatitudes, and they present this to us and describe them a little bit. But the one thing that was interesting is that on the apostolic side, what this section I was going to say is where the midwayers talk to the reader. It's one of the few times that I think that they do this. And let me just read a short paragraph here, which talks about this earthly possessions. They say, he never taught his followers to avoid earthly possessions, only his 12 apostles. Luke, the physician, was a strong believer in social equality, and he did much to interpret Jesus' sayings in harmony with his personal beliefs. Jesus never personally directed his followers to adopt a communal mode of life. He made no pronouncement of any sort regarding such matters. So even though, in my perspective, that I believe that the Beguines in this hybrid situation are forming a little cleft in society, a breach in society, and it lasted almost 400 or 500 years, I suppose, until the 16th century. And it's this idea of trying to attempt, I think, not only personal religion, but to really understand the apostolic way of doing this. And that's what I think we're all talking about this whole service, to be in the community, to be in the world at the same time as you can learn how to be spiritual. Jesus certainly made the apostles go at least 2 by 2 to go spend time with with the world. That was essentially one of the messages that I took out of part 4 anyway, is that's a really important part of it. So more to come on this, I suppose, but I noticed that this beginnages that were built and supported for a period of time started to, I think, put this breach into society that took a very long time to fully express itself. And it probably hasn't fully expressed itself even today. Back over.
Thank you. I would simply offer a couple reactions to what you said in describing the spirit of the material in paper 140. You were not implying that in applying it to the Beguines, there was some kind of an ordination. The women who live in the Beguinages were not clergy, were not being ordained as clergy. They did embody some of the same spiritual attitudes. But the fact that they were not part of the structure of the formal Christian church was an important advantage. Am I largely in a vein that you can agree with?
Well, sure. If I gave the impression that there was some sort of an ordination for the Beguines, no, they're totally opposite of that. In many ways, but in other ways, they sustain the aberrations, and some of those aberrations are, this whole sexual problem of chastity. I mean, that was rampant in that society for a very long period of time. So, no, certainly not. But yeah, very, very closely, and I think that there's some lessons here to try to take a look at. Of what is the difference between an apostolic, a fatherhood, a father service, personal religion format versus a brotherhood format. And paper 140 speaks quite a bit about that.
Thank you. I understand what you've just said, and it certainly helps me relate to your previous remarks, because the point of brotherhood and the point of personal service is indeed a distinction, whereby the Beguines and the Beguinages were serving people in society, not simply accommodating the rigid structure of the organized institutional church. Doreen, I'm sorry, you have ideas? I was going to call on you to read, but if you wish to contribute additional thoughts.
To the segment, Jeff. So I think you're forgetting me today. Nevertheless, I'll just chime in very little and I'll read afterwards. So they said that, the women, you have to remember, did this work out of love, getting closer to God. It has to come from, your heart and soul. They really wanted to grow towards God consciousness. They weren't there to do the rituals that the church had always done. So, but they said that the church perceived this then as an attempt to undermine their authority and their credibility, because the church promoted salvation through faith rather than through the church and its sacraments. So that was really not an acceptable thing. And there was a woman, she wrote a book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, and she expressed this. And she said that her name was Porrette, Beguine Marguerite Porrette. She wrote The Mirror of Souls. And she discussed this, and because she wouldn't recant what she had told them through her writings, they burnt her at the stake. This is how it was. You either conform to what the male hierarchy says and does, or you're dead. You're done. So it really is, it's much more beneficial for the women to separate themselves from the church. And because remember, society was changing and the needs of the people change. It cannot only stay the same from generation to generation, from century to century. Anyway, I'll stop and—
Thank you. I would simply like to interject the remark appropriately about the fact that the questions of criticism and the compromise that was eventually reached are matters that we will discuss in greater depth when we get down later on in the page.
Okay.
But the underlying spirit of the women was indeed a desire to serve and not simply to go through routines of formal observance. So now, Doreen, if you have enough stamina, I would like you to read 2 paragraphs. The paragraph at the bottom of page 28 that begins with the rapid spread of the Beguines, and then on the next page, why were so many women attracted to the movement. So if Bob can move the screen around so that this becomes possible for you, I would appreciate it. So please go ahead, Doreen.
So the rapid spread of the Beguines is one of the most arresting religious phenomena of the latter Middle Ages. As they gradually secured recognition from the authorities of church and state, Beguinages sprang up everywhere in the northern towns. In some cases, the houses were purchased out of funds brought to the communities by new members. In others, buildings were donated by members of the ruling nobility. By the end of the 13th century, Namur contained 5 beguinages, and Cologne, the biggest and most populous of northern German cities, had witnessed 54 such foundations. In Brussels, where the beguinages enjoyed the patronage of the Dukes of Brabant, they were allowed to appropriate the chapel of La Vigne to their use. And they secured a right to have their own chaplains and their own burial ground. Here, as in other towns of the Low Countries, they came to constitute a separate enclave within the city. Do you want me to go on?
Yes, please, the next paragraph also.
So why were so many women attracted to the movement? The relatively free regime of the beguinage, which offered its members a total surrender to God through a life of prayer and active service to their neighbors, clearly met the spiritual aspirations of women who had heard the call to the apostolic life. Just as the nuns and canonesses had provided a home for the ladies of the landed classes for whom no suitable marriage could be found, the beguinages in turn offered a refuge to the surplus daughters and the widows of the wealthier bourgeoisie. Nor were they only a haven for the unmarriageable. The religious life offered an escape, usually the only escape for girls who found themselves forced by their families into marriage they did not desire. Being the children of affluent families, they were readily attracted to the ascetical ideal of voluntary poverty, and also, no doubt, by the relative absence of institutional constraint that characterized the life in the beguinages.
Thank you. There is a great deal in these 2 paragraphs. Bob, I would ask you to keep it on the screen. If you could move it back up to the first paragraph. The point that I'd like to ask about is why this worked out so rapidly. Why were so many people, so many women of this time suddenly enthusiastic? It seems almost like the spread of ideas in the social media in our era. What was going on here that made these possibilities of the beguinages so popular, and why did they multiply so rapidly? Francois, do you have an idea about that?
Yes. The first thing was non-balance between men and women. It was because the men with the warfare, there was a lot of young men that were killed at war, so many widows. But there was a certain unbalance there. It's the first thing, but maybe not the main thing. The other thing, it was a new opportunity offered to women. They have an affinity with that kind of life and service, and now they had the opportunity for that. There was no opportunities, no such opportunities before, and now they have.
Thank you. Gary, I'm interested in the implications about the power structure that are part of this paragraph. It states that the nobility were donating land or donating money, and in some cases, the Beguines enjoyed the patronages of the dukes, in this case, the Dukes of Brabant, which is part of Belgium today. Why was the nobility so willing to sponsor this kind of an activity, frankly, that was not a function of men and male authority?
Thank you, Neil. And I think you need to take a step back, because the nobility were following. Who were they following? Well, they were following as they gradually secured recognition from the authorities of the church and the state. So the church and the state recognized them. But why would they want to recognize, the church and the state would recognize them? I mean, so you have the nunneries, you have the monasticism, you have that in place. And then all of a sudden, you've got a new group of people that's come up, and they've now got the permission to go there. Let's not forget, and the nobility as well, is that the richest people at that particular time was the church, and then it was even richer in some cases than the state. So once I think the seal of approval was given by the authorities of the church and the state, then the nobility then said, well, if that works for these two organizations, put in layman's terms, then we'll go along with this. And of course, what were they going to be getting out of that? How would they look towards, because, there's no free dinners, there must be something in their mind. And of course, they were seen to be doing good. And I think maybe if it's not in this paragraph, somewhere down the line there, they will also have the ability to choose from there for marriage as well, ladies for marriage. So, but the crux of it is, all of a sudden, the church and the state said, yeah, you can go ahead after hundreds of years. It's a phenomenon that I can't sort of get a grip onto. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Doreen, I wonder if we can read into the first paragraph that you read, the idea that these activities of the Beguines and the Beguinages were spiritually attractive, even to men, even to the ruling class. Is that what you would see in this paragraph, and why suddenly so many of them came online? You gave money or land for the purpose?
Well, sure. Oh, yeah, I'm not muted. Sure, because it's so attractive when you see people reaching out and really doing the work and not hiding themselves in sitting a prayer all day long and all these rituals that they've always done for centuries. And here they were teaching, they were ministering, they were helping in every area. And why wouldn't it be attractive when people come knocking on your door and you have needs and you don't have to go, to their churches or their monasteries to see them and then just say all these rituals, Here they created something very unique. And it was very appealing, and it would be at any time, I believe, when people really are sincerely wanting to help you. But of course, that doesn't always go well, where now you're taking the limelight away from the tradition of the church, and this is where there's conflict in. And then they have these. I forgot, these meetings where they change the rules again. And it said, but once it's out of the bag, you can't put it back. And the women were able to develop their potential. They did writing and music, and they really had so many talents that they were not allowed to express, with the men. Like this, they were free now to explore all different areas. And it grew and grew by leaps and bounds. Why wouldn't you be attracted to something like that? And of course, the compensation is donations. When something works, people want to support it.
Thank you. The conclusion that I was reaching for, I believe you have supported, that this was spiritual attraction, in a sense that the women concerned were doing very valuable work for others in the community. And furthermore, that their motivation was clearly pious and praiseworthy. So part of the point that I'm trying to reach for is that the nobility in a political sense that was in control of the society did not resent the fact that these women explicitly were under their own control and were operating for themselves. The problems that you have mentioned a couple of times and that we will discuss later has to do with the fact that the women were not explicitly under the formal hierarchy of the church. But what I'm trying to reach to is that the nobles in society, the political structure, was more attuned to the spiritual and social benefit of these women than the formal hierarchy of the church. Is that a conclusion that you would agree with?
Yeah, and you said it better than I could. So.
Well, it's kind of you to say that, and I will have to explain that I was not trying to ignore you before. It's very hard to keep track of every person who wishes to speak.
It wouldn't be the
Gary, does this discussion about the power structure and the willingness of male political leaders to support the efforts of these women make something or create some ideas on your part? You're muted again.
Yes, very much so. But I think you also got to look into another context on this, and that is, they could see these women doing good. Now, before, women were in the monastery and they were there. They didn't want to get married and they didn't find a suitor and so on and so forth. But these people of nobility, when they see these people doing good, and they like to have the lady and so on and so forth. I think there's another add-on to that, and if I can put it in that way, and that is they want children, and they want their children to be brought up in a way that is in God's way. And I go back to the Knight Templars, and the Knight Templars, when they went to the church and said, look, and the priest said, look, the more money you give me, the higher you will get in heaven. And this is exactly a phenomenon that was carried on by, if the more they do good, the higher they would get. And also their children would be brought up in such a manner from a lovely lady they were marrying. Before, that would not have happened because it wasn't in place. That the sort of mindset was not in place.
Thank you. Bob, do you want to come in now? I was on the verge of moving to discuss the next paragraph, but you're certainly free to come in at this point if you wish.
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts. I like the thread where we're all getting to this idea that it's a spiritual undertaking. Since we still have the share up, I'm going to move this paragraph up here where I think this is your question. Why were so many women attracted to the movement? Hunger strikes come to mind. Why are hunger strikes so effective? We can go in history and see all of the individuals who have done this, very prominent ones, of course, and great social changes taken with them. I think because when, and Doreen, said it very, very well there, is that these activities are basically leading to spiritual insight. Not necessarily cosmic insight, because the revelation is really providing the cosmic insight for us. But it's true spiritual insight, which I believe is driven by faith. When you apply not only I'm going to put this in quotes, piousness to one's activities of life, meaning service to others, there's a faith aspect that's really being presented here. In all of Jesus' miracles, I said this a couple of webinars ago, some of the reason that he did these healings and such was because of the faith of the individual. And that in itself, I think says miles of what's really going on here. So, all of these outside things that are really taking place are just indicative of the way that these individuals, women, and by the way, this was not aristocratic women. We're just to kind of reinforce that. This was communities of much lower economic and social status females. And I think just like a hunger strike, these human activities are reaching up to the super rational area of faith. And I see rational things that have to, it's almost an irrational move for someone to go on a hunger strike for some other higher ideal that they're trying to portray back to society. And I think that's why they're effective, because spiritual pressure from above is a very interesting thing. And when humans pursue that, that's when we really get social change. Over.
Thank you. I would like to pursue ideas in the middle of this next paragraph that begins, why were so many women attracted to the movement? Specifically, I would like to do what we can to understand the social context. It seems to me that we have three levels of society that are implicitly being discussed in these pages about the possibilities for women believers. There is the aristocratic level, and there seems to be the level of relatively affluent bourgeois families. And then there is the common people, perhaps women living in an agricultural environment on the land or working in the towns who might possibly be active in the marketplace. But I wonder, Francois, whether you would associate these beginnages and the beguines with the middle level. It seems to be the case here. We're not talking about the truly poor women. We're not talking about the lowest levels of peasants. Refuge to the surplus daughters and the widows of the wealthier bourgeoisie. And then in the final sentence of the paragraph, it states, being the children of affluent families. So do you associate this with the middle group or the more affluent middle class rather than with the people who were truly poor?
Yes, I'm more with the middle class and upper class, but it was not the main point. It attract people of any class, but the very poor, they was not able to. But it opened more open to more middle class people, but there were people with wealth, but other with a little less, but all those people gathered in the beginning age.
So if I understand you correctly, and I'm in effect partly paraphrasing myself, the beginnages seem to be an opportunity for girls who came from comfortable circumstances. They were not aristocratic circumstances, but they were comfortable. Am I correct? Is that what you see? Yes. Also? Now I'd like to ask Doreen, about a sentence almost to the end of the paragraph where the author states, the religious life offered an escape, usually the only escape for girls who found themselves forced by their families into a marriage they did not desire. So are we talking about a circumstance of not only arranged marriages, but in some cases arranged against the wishes of the daughter?
Against the wishes of the daughter?
Is that what this paragraph, that sentence says? That sometimes parents in these circumstances were trying to force a daughter to marry someone she didn't want to marry?
Oh, yeah. Well, they married for, people who they could gain, either territory, money, status. They always married, for purposes. They married their daughters off. So that, but it wasn't right for the daughters because they weren't in love with these people and it was awful. I mean, I've seen so many movies with that. I suppose that does depict the age, what they used to do to them. So absolutely, why would you want to do that? So you had no escape. Remember, for the most part, they couldn't, where were they going to go? I used to ask some people who came from Europe and about why didn't you get out when your towns were overrun with say the Nazis, whatever, or before that actually. And they said we had no transportation, no place to go, they had no money. What are they going to do? So this was great that they had these homes for women, and women do protect one another and they help each other. And of course, it's a really supportive group where the men were threatened by them, of course, because they were intimidated. They could not understand them, number one. And I think that is, we talked about last time, the lack of understanding about the innovation of women and how the men think. So you can't, that old expression, you can't keep a good person down. And when you give them a little rope, boy, they can go out and they could do great things with that. But they didn't have other opportunities. So is that what you're asking, that it fostered a great opportunity for them to get away from the over control of family and church and whatever?
Yes, by implication, I've sort of moved over into a minor exploration of the psychology of marriage. We've talked about arranged marriages. Previously, we talked about aristocratic families arranging marriages or failing to do so for their aristocratic daughters and then putting them in a nunnery instead.
Yeah.
Here, the author is stating that some girls from relatively prosperous middle-class families were trying to avoid a marriage with someone they did not like or did not want, that their parents were seeking to compel them to carry out. And instead, they may have gone into the beguinage as a way of escaping that possibility. Does this make sense to you, Doreen?
There was a lot of information on the medieval mind, and it really took on the psychology, and it was mostly, at least among the educated elite and many of the clerics, and they wrote a lot of text. But remember, the women didn't write the text. The point is, it was always, everything was understood and, from one point of view. If you asked and discussed these things with the opposite sex, you would have at least a well-rounded understanding of the reasoning for the psychology of how and why and what they did. So it's, it's different with us today. We understand things because we're more educated now. But where did they get that from? They didn't. So that psychology at that time was lacking. And the medieval psychology had lots of problems. And they didn't know, how to handle it. So they reverted back, I guess, to the stage, what do you call it? That, it's like on the computer, to the, what is that? I can't think of the word. I'm so sorry.
You're talking about social networking or something like that?
Yeah, but there's just a word that encompasses it all, and it just went right out of my head. But everything was in the realm of, the psychology and the domain of men and their, theologians, and how they understood their desires, their intents, through their sin, their virtue. And you can't look for, there was no cross section of understanding. And that's what kind of I was default to the default position. That was the word I was thinking of. So.
Okay, thank you. But Francois, I'd like to go back to this question of social classes. It seems to me that if we interpret the participation of women in traditional nunneries, they appear to have been mostly women from the upper class who were serving themselves, or at least serving their own spiritual needs in the nunnery, without really exerting any form of service to the society. The women in beguinages seem to be from the relatively comfortable middle class, and they were not only serving themselves, they were showing pious motives and served many others in society, including people who were poor. Whereas the poor were receiving this benefit from the beguinages, they were certainly not receiving any benefit from the nunneries or the monasteries. Does this make sense to you? Is that essentially how you look at it in terms
Yes, it makes sense to me. And maybe one thing that women wanted to reject in beguinage is the status of inferiority. And in the beguinage, I don't think that the women find that they are inferior beings, and they are helpful. Someone want to be helpful to others, and it's a good way for self-esteem and for to continue to do something helpful that you don't find in the nunneries. It's for yourself, and but you don't have to decide of what you're doing to help. It attracts people that want to be in the field and work and do something. And you find it in the middle class and upper class too, that are appealed by this lifestyle, but it's very different from the nunneries.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I would like now to, I'm sorry. Okay, Bob, you have additional contributions. Please go ahead.
Yeah, two thoughts about this come up here. One is, I accept what, is this Lawrence, C.H. Lawrence?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah. I accept that this occurred, that there were some wealthier bourgeois that did come into the beguinages. I can't prove this or anything, but this is just a visceral thought about thinking about this here again as you're asking it. If it did occur in large numbers, then I think it caused an issue for the beguinages, because I can't see these particular women of the aristocratic venue to really be supportive of the service. I think they would eschew that. Now, if they didn't, okay, I don't think we have enough data on that. And what Doreen said was very interesting. She said, everything that's been written about these came out of that period of time were men. So, I think of Jesus's statement where he said, you need to take the mote out of your own eye before you take the beam out of another. And I think that's what we have going on here. And in fact, I just happened to come across, all of these women historians, And I realized that we've got mostly male historians here, so I decided to try to take a a different cut. And I mentioned last week that it's you get a slightly different flavor, and in fact, I think that's a good thing to do. At least I hope it's a good thing to do. But I'm not so sure that I really buy that this was a good thing, and that these bourgeois females who had moved into the nunnery are really not unwitting secularists, while the beguinage women are not really unwitting secularists. They're living in the secular society and doing spiritual things. Over.
I am a little bit confused by some of the vocabulary. So far, at least as much as I can understand, the trend of analysis seems to have associated the aristocratic upper class with the nunneries and with the with the nunneries. The monasteries were not so exclusive. And the author seems to be associating the prosperous middle class with the beguinages as a source of service. So when you said that you were not sure that the aristocratic women moving into the beguinages were motivated to serve, I'm a little confused, because I thought the aristocratic women were mainly in the nunneries.
Yeah.
Okay, so is it
my
credible
impression
to you that we're talking about a spirit of service and piety that led women from the prosperous middle class to serve in beguinages and to apply their energies to helping the poor or others in society in general?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Oh, in most cases, from how I'm interpreting this, is the women went in not with the most with the best intentions. Either they were forced to go in, or they became widows and they became poor. But it was an escape. I don't see anything that's an escape. Has the intention, and this is my impression of this, of course, has an intention of service. They're escaping, and I don't think that the beguinage women, from what I can tell, were necessarily escaping.
Thank you. I have to go back to your remarks, which are a mixture. You are saying essentially that the nuns were at least partly escaping. We have to say nuns and canonesses. And you're distinguishing that from the spiritual motivations that led women to serve others in the beguinages. Is that a correct impression?
Exactly. That's the exact dichotomy that I'm bringing out here.
Thank you. I would like to move down to the next paragraph toward the bottom of the page. It follows the line "on the other hand." So I will read that, and I would like, if I could ask Gary to read just the short paragraph immediately after the heading. So here we go with the heading, "On the other hand, not everyone was pleased, to put the matter mildly." Gary?
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, okay. The women's movement encountered much hostile criticism from both the laity and the more conservative sections of the clergy. The spectacle of the laywoman without the sanction of any religious order engaging in an active apostolic role was offensive to both male and chauvinism and clerical professionalism.
Thank you. That's as far as I want to go right now. You can read more later, but I want to stop at this point.
Okay.
What is your view of the phrase male chauvinism? Why were these activities of the Beguines offensive to male chauvinism?
Are you asking me?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh,
how do you interpret that? What were the features of this activity that were offensive to male chauvinism?
from my perspective, is that this had never been from a male point of view. They've always had women hand to hand in the nunnery and in other sections where they were told what to do. Now, this is a breakout from that. This is something new, and it's a challenge to them, and they don't like that challenge. There is, I would imagine that they're, and this exactly, from my point of view, is where the women have been repressed all those years. At the end of this, I believe that this is the opening where they can see they're going to break away from the male dominance. They're going to have, they've had enough. They've had the 15, 14, 1300 years. Now here is an opportunity. They're going to take this opportunity. And the male chauvinists, I wouldn't say pigs in those days, but they did treat the people very badly, especially the women. They were suppressed, and they didn't like that. Thank you.
Okay, I wonder if now I can paraphrase what you've just said is I am best able to understand it. Up to now, in previous circumstances, the nunneries and monasteries, women were obliged to do what men told them. Whereas in this case, in the beginnings, women were acting on their own volition in their own ways and were not simply taking orders. Is that the difference?
Correct. That's how I see that. And this is a tremendous opening for women. All these years now they can see there's an opening, and they're going to take it.
Thank you. I would now like to turn to Francois and have him comment, if he can, on why this apostolic role of the Beguines and the Beguinages was offensive to clerical professionalism. Why was that a feature that caused some people to be annoyed? You have to unmute yourself, Francois. I'm sorry.
It's a question I ask myself too. Why? But what I think is that these women were not nuns or canonesses, and they were not professionals like teachers or scholars. So, and they were teaching that they were doing what the religious were doing and what the professionals were doing. There was they act like nurses and doctors, and say that they have like some kind of hospitals. So they took a lot of place that habitually reserved to the professionals or the religious, is how I interpret that. And it was a lack of control, just that. Those people have a loss of control.
All right, let me paraphrase your thought and see if you can largely relate to my paraphrase. Was this an infringement on the monopoly of the ordained clerics and monks, that they previously monopolized this apostolic role and the role of piety, and instead the women are cutting into their monopoly? Is that the problem?
You said it. It's good. Yes, it's exactly what a loss of monopoly. Yeah.
So the clerics had a monopoly, and now the women are ignoring that previous monopoly and acting in religious ways that do not require the authority of men. Am I on the same wavelength as you, Francois?
That's right.
Okay, Doreen, you have referred to these problems earlier. I wonder if you have additional insights into the underlying psychological differences and dilemmas that this paragraph explains rather briefly.
Sure. So again, you know, why do they remember the nuns, of course, took their vows, the Beguines didn't. So they weren't under the oversight of the clerics. What happens? Why did they call them names? Why did the clerics call these Beguines all kinds of names, call them prostitutes, all this stuff, because they were threatened. So, I mean, it's obvious. Anytime people use names to demean someone else is because they're threatened. So the fear of changing the way things are done, and you can't put, again, the genie back in the bottle. This is, the women refused to recant their beliefs, and they said no, and that's when they were executed. Now, what are you going to do if you have to live with fear instead of faith? I mean, this to me is totally, either you get out or, you know, you recant. So, of course, they didn't, you know, there was no compromise there, and they really said no. Nope, they weren't. Because then they look, like I said before, the one woman who said something, wrote a book, they burnt her at the stake. Is this their way of showing God's love for humanity, for women, for anyone? And the people that saw it, they said, were so appalled to see how this woman who was burnt at the stake, she didn't say a word. She stood, they were just absolutely astonished at her courage. Well, what does that say to you? You know, the men cannot win. Well, those men anyway. Terrible thing. Anyway, there's a lot more when you talk about the next paragraph.
Thank you. I would go back to a comment that I believe you made last week, that burning at the stake was the only way of executing a woman. So it was not just for these supposedly religious offenses that a woman was burned at the stake, but for any serious crime, she could be burned at the stake, because that was their legal system at the time. Am I correct?
I'm sorry, but only if it applied where it didn't apply to, it applied to men differently. So yes, in certain things that they believed was critical, that they should be burned. And that is any heresy, I suppose. Anything you say that doesn't agree with the controlling group, you know, in the church. Well, that's heresy, and that's it. And they wouldn't stand down and change their mind. So,
okay, I'd like to go on to the next paragraph and would ask Gary to resume his reading. He was sad that he ended up previously reading only 5 lines, but now we're going to give him quite a bit more. This paragraph runs on longer, and it actually includes a continuation on the next page that Bob will make available. That's very good. Now it seems to be entirely visible. Gary, could you read that longer paragraph now, please? You're not.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Okay. In the end, the conflict was resolved by compromise. The Council of Vienne, which is now Vienna, in 1312, censured certain women, commonly called Beguines, who lose themselves in foolish speculations on the Trinity and the divine essence. These women promise obedience to nobody, and they neither renounce their property nor profess any approved rule. Their way of life was permanently forbidden, but this was without prejudice to those faithful women who wish to live as the Lord shall inspire them, following a life of penance and living chastity together in the auspices, even if they had taken no vow. In other words, the Beguines would be tolerated as long as they stayed in their convents and accepted clerical supervision. Female vagrancy and other similar antics were not acceptable. Most Beguines, in fact, attached themselves to houses of Franciscan and Dominican friars who supplied them with spiritual directors and confessors.
Okay, I wonder if I could ask you to continue on, at least in analyzing part of this. No, Bob, the phrase in the middle of the first paragraph that Gary read, these women promise obedience to nobody. Why is that an important criticism, at least in the minds of the people who said this? I'm sorry, Gary. I'm asking you about the idea of obedience. Why was the fact that there was no vow of obedience a major issue for the men who were criticizing this?
Well, from my point of view, the beginners themselves, all right, didn't think it justified for that to take place. Who made them? Where was the laws for them to say that they had to do that? And
yes, for sure. But my question to you is, why were the men offended at the lack of a promise of obedience?
well, they've never come across this in their lives before, because they have had not women obedient to them through the centuries. And this goes against manlyhood. When you're told what to do, you do it. And they were not going to be doing that. They're not following those instructions. And that, I think, many men lost face over that. And when you lose face, you have an ego problem. And that, to me, it was insufferable in those days.
So if I can apply a colloquial term from our generation, would you say that the men were reacting, in effect, that these women were too uppity?
Very much so. Very much so. They've never come across that. They had this way of life. They were brought up like that from their fathers, their grandfathers, that the women do what you tell them to. And there's no back chat. There's no coming back. There's no, if it's not done, then there was punishment. But these women would thought that that was worth it. And don't forget, there wasn't just one or two. There were thousands of these women.
Thank you, Bob. I'd like to proceed now into the end of the same sentence, that nor profess any approved rule. So we read earlier that the beginnages did not involve vows. There was not a hierarchical structure. There was not a promise of obedience, as we've discussed, but there was also no written text giving them detailed instructions about what they were to do every minute of the day, as of course was the case of a Benedictine monk or nun. A rule that gave them detailed instructions. So the fact that the Beguines did not have such a rule was a criticism. Why was that important to the men who made this criticism?
Well, the Supreme Court made its decision. Of course, they're not under the rule of law, but we have a minority running society here. And I think I can't say it any better than Gary said it. There isn't any backtracking. So, okay, so the first thing is you're going to get supervision. You're going to get spiritual directors and confessors. And if you don't do that, like Doreen says, you're going to sit at the stake. So, that's where the mores of that society were. I'd like to point out the sentence that Lawrence says, where is it there? Oh yeah, that they had obedience to nobody. I would say that they professed obedience to God, and I think that was the beginning of where they ran into trouble, because the religious, well, both the religious and the societal mores were You take these intercessors, you take these spiritual directors and confessors, they're in the middle. They have to be, they're the holy ones. How did the, how does our revelation in paper 195 say, some professions are not holy and others are secular? Well, I think that's where we were in this society here. And that's why I think that this is an important aspect of the Beguines, is that they breached this. And this is, a lot of what they did will not express itself until many centuries later, but it was a good beginning.
All right, let me push you just slightly. I think you're saying that the observances and the piety and the personal ministry of the Beguines was pretty close approximation of personal religion. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I've said that, Neil. I've said that more than once. I think that as we look at this, I think we can safely say, Francois has even said it. I think you have, Francois, that they're getting close. They're breaking away from this intercessory and going right to God. And that's why I said, I didn't find any text, and this is a much deeper study, that their obedience was to God. I don't know if that's the case, but I sure would believe that with the way that they operated and with the way that that they took risk, I think that's the case.
Thank you. We, of course, are now at the bottom of page 29, which basically
Francois got his hand up.
I'm sorry?
If you have a few minutes, excuse
Yes,
me.
go ahead, Francois.
I think
I
I
didn't
found-
notice your interest, and now we can see that the fact that I failed to notice your interest is similar to an earlier failure whereby I did not notice Doreen's interest. So it's not a discriminatory measure, Doreen. I can't quite see everything going on, but go
Just
ahead.
like Vince
Francois.
Lombardi, you treat everybody the same. That's great.
Yes, well,
I found something interesting in Wikipedia, and that relates to the woman that was burned at the stake that Doreen talked about. It's for Marguerite Porret. So Marguerite Porret, she wrote a mystical book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, and in my opinion, she was near to close to the revelation of the thought adjuster and even the fusion. She was very near that. And if you have just a few minutes, I will read what I found. Okay, his book provokes some controversy, likely because of statements such as a soul annihilated in the love of the Creator could and should grant to nature all that. Okay, no, that's what she says is that. Okay, the book describes the annihilation of the soul, specifically its descent into a state of nothingness, of union with God without distinction. While clearly popular throughout the Middle Age and beyond, perhaps dozens of copies circulated throughout late medieval Western Europe, the book provoked some controversy, likely because of statements such as a soul annihilated in the love of the Creator could and should grant to nature all that it desires, which some took to mean that a soul can become one with God, and that when it in this state, it can ignore moral law. As
thank you, Francois.
it had no need to the church, no need for the church and its sacraments. So you ignore the moral law, and you don't need no more the sacraments of the church. So to make a long story short, it's why they burned her. It was because it was not with the teachings of the Catholic faith concerning the sacraments and all that stuff. So. But the thing, if you are one with God, you can do what you want, and go beyond moral laws. So maybe
Thank you. That was very, excuse me, did you finish your
Yes.
idea there?
I finish.
Thank you. That was very helpful analytically, because I think the passage that you have read is a fairly clear demonstration that in terms of theology, and not simply in terms of discipline, this woman, this lady, was quite apart from the traditional teachings of the Christian church. And so what you are implying, I think, from what I understand correctly, is that she was considered wrong in her theology from the perspective of the accumulated theological interpretations of the Christian church, which would supply an additional motivation for having her burned at the stake. In other words, we come close to the idea that they interpreted her to be a heretic.
Yes.
Is that your understanding?
Yes. And if we had a time machine and return in those times with the Urantia book, we are all burned at the stakes.
Yes, we certainly would be considered heretics, all of us,
Mhm.
from the perspective of the Christian church of the Middle Ages.
Yes.
I would now like to continue the discussion onto the long paragraph on page 30. Bob, could I prevail on you to read that, please?
Sure. In its tame form, the beguinage survived the onslaught of its critics and persecutors. In many of the cities of the Rhineland, northern France, and the Low Countries, it remained an established and respected institution, providing a home for the sick and destitute as well as for the sisterhood. In a limited sense, the Beguines represented a movement of women's liberation. Even after their wilder manifestations had been suppressed, their informal associations offered unmarried women a greater degree of freedom and initiative than was allowed them either in a traditional convent or in a lay family. Their simple piety, based upon study of the vernacular Bible and their cultivation of mystical experience, which in the writings of Hadowich of Antwerp was expressed in the erotic imagery of the Browmistic or bridal mysticism, placed them alongside the friars as preachers and exponents of a new kind of religious experience. It was a distinctively feminine spirituality, individualistic and intuitive, which focused upon the humanity of Christ and sought to identify with his sufferings by mortification of the body.
Thank you. This paragraph has many different elements that correspond to, shall we say, characteristic inclinations of women in a psychological sense. We will not say that we are analyzing all the psychological elements, but the author is portraying certain features that connect with us now. In a limited sense, he says, a movement of women's liberation. And then a distinctively feminine spirituality, individualistic and intuitive. So are we really getting here the idea of a different point of view in regard to God and religious experience that is indeed feminine? Doreen, will you take that?
Oh, well, we all have different attributes, and if allowed to be expressed and developed, there's potential for everyone in different areas. Well, under this is extraordinary achievement. So these women throughout those Middle Ages accomplished a great deal, which some of the things are used today. I understood, the music and the poetry. I had read in other books about them, and it was very interesting because why not? Women are creative, and maybe men are more scientific, but here's the expression how They wrote, they composed, there's philosophy, and of course the mystic and visionary. I don't, I remember coming across it, but I'm not sure, they were competing with the old stuff and the new stuff. I remember from the church, they called them, the mystics, and that was another area. But anyway, you skipped a whole bunch of stuff. But anyway, I think it's wonderful that they could achieve these things and show the society at the time how they could move into more an open understanding of the flowery, from each sex, that we have things to contribute in and of our own aptitude. And you can't stifle that. You can't take back what is flowing from you. When you love God and you have all these emotions, and it's expressed in poetry and philosophy, and you start thinking, well, you can't live under fear, because if the church is going to control you and they're threatened by you, what happens is fear stifles your ability to make decisions. You stop thinking for yourself. You give up all your understanding, and you either fall into, I guess, the line with the church, or you leave it. You cannot stop what's coming from your heart and soul. And so these are just expressions, I think, of their, what was already in them. The founder of scientific natural history in Germany. Well, there's another. How wonderful. But I think there are a lot of them that were educated. These are distinguished women. They studied and they followed other distinguished, I guess, men. It doesn't come from nowhere. You had to have a background in some of it, as far as I understand. I didn't go back in the papers where it all did say these things. I didn't know you were going to jump ahead. But that's, anyway, for what it's worth, that's how I understood this section of achievement.
Thank you, Gary. Perhaps a softball question. Bob frequently tells me that I ask curveball questions, but this one I intend to be sending to you as a softball question, and I think right along the middle. Is the net message of this paragraph, and perhaps of the entire 2 pages about the beginnings that we've been reading, the idea that the impulses and reactions to spirituality are creative and original, and there should not be a single frame for expressing one's reality and love of God? Is that part of the message here?
Yeah, I believe so. On that, Neil, and I'd like to just sort of go back just a little on the page. I think we didn't pick up. In other words, the beginners would be tolerated as long as they stayed in their convents and accepted clerical supervision. Now, once again, they are trying to make a move, and they are being told, "You're not going to do this. This is the way we want you now." So that once again, they're under control, and they're trying to break out all the time from the repression that they've had, or women have had, over the many centuries. And they are looking to have their own way of praying, their own way of giving their own grace to God, and they are not going to be dictated to. They've had enough. And as you can see, that a lot of people and a lot of societies were starting to go against them, but they would not give in. They are strong, and they kept on going. And with respect, see where women are today, say, but this is where it all started. This is one of the fundamental building blocks. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Bob. I would then paraphrase this idea again and ask whether, in effect, the beginnings and the beginnages were, to use a present term, an anti-monopolistic movement. in the sense that they were objecting to the monopoly of religiousness that came from the clergy. They were also objecting to the monopoly of religious approaches coming from men. So can we call this, in effect, an anti-monopolistic effort on their part?
You could call it that.
It doesn't do justice to the whole dimensions, but does there seem to be an effort to break up a monopoly?
No, I don't think that they had anything of that in mind. I think that's the outcome, and I think we can apply that as an outcome. And I give you, it's a fair term to use, at least as we're seeing this in a meta picture. So, sure. I mentioned in the last discussion that we've got a minority that's setting prices, basically ruling society and delivering the mores with an iron fist. Now, as the mores change, i.e. the Beguines, this is where we have some trouble. So yeah, I'd certainly give you the okay on that one to use. I have a couple things I want to mention about this paragraph, though, if I could.
Go ahead, please.
Well, the sentence, though, there's a lot in this paragraph that stands out that I struggled with, to say the least. So bear me out here a little bit here. The sentence that says it was a distinctively feminine spirituality, individualistic and intuitive. I think we were just discussing this as, what's a feminine spirituality? I mean, is it, why is the feminine spirituality individualistic and intuitive? If the author means that intuitive is spiritual insight through faith, then I would say, then that's what Jesus taught. A personal religion. I think that's what he means about individualistic. But to call it a feminine spirituality, I think is not what our revelation, not how I perceive our revelation as informing us. The other thing that kind of got, and I don't know the answer to this one here, there are two types of forms of beguinages. It was a tamed one and a wilder manifestation. And I suppose that, well, I don't know the answer to that. So I just call on the group to say, does anybody know, what the author means by tamed or wilder?
Well, I cannot pretend to have researched this deeply, but I would offer you a couple of features more or less on the linguistic level. When the author says it was a distinctively feminine spirituality, I don't believe that he means it was the only possibility of feminine spirituality. He has used a distinctively, not the distinctively. And so he is not saying that this is the only way that females have. He is saying that this is a particular illustration that he interprets to be feminine. Now, back up to the wild idea, that wilder manifestations, I frankly can't interpret that except in the context of the previous idea about carrying on activities in public that were not approved and so on. So unless we were to study this in much greater detail than we have the time to do, I think that the underlying point that the author seems to be making is that this was a procedure that became acceptable in a very broad sense. The previous paragraph indicated an implicit connection with some of the Cistercian monasteries and acceptance of confessors and advisors coming from the Cistercian monasteries. And so at that point, the manifestations were no longer wild. They were somewhat under observance and approval in a very broad sense. Does that more or less answer your question?
Yeah, I think we're good there, Neil. That's a good description. So if I drew a circle around this entire paragraph, I applaud the author for presenting this. We have the capability of being able to apply the framework of a revelation against this, and that's why I struggled with this a little bit, to try and say, okay, I'm not going to be critical of the author because I know that he's kind of drawing out some of this this really interesting approach that the Beguines provide us in this history. What I find, so this is, draw a circle around it. He's giving us some facts and he's making some opinions here that, based upon the fact that the author doesn't, well, I'm assuming that the author hasn't read the Revelation, he would have said something a little bit differently. But I think he's getting to the point, and I I applaud that. What I really like is the fact that that we've got a very interesting part of history here that has been bubbling underneath, and for those individuals that really develop a personal relationship with God, I think that's where society is. We're seeing society move, and the expression of this showed up in the 10th century, and well, I guess it went about 500 years for it to finally break apart. Oh, but the final point I was going to make, I almost forgot this, was from the article from the Times that I mentioned earlier. It was a 2006 article. The author had traveled to Belgium and was explaining all the places, the wonderful places that some of the beguinages are broken down, and some of them are turned into nice museums. The fact that they've remained, I think, and that they're part of the society's history, I think is a really interesting statement to make. And the fact that we're hearing about this in the 21st century is also something that's very interesting. So I'll just kind of let it rest at that. But that's an interesting paragraph, to say the least.
Thank you. I agree with your characterization of the paragraph as being quite interesting. In terms of the background of the historians, I have in this section on the situation of women, and in other sections too, drawn extensively on the writings of C.H. Lawrence and, to a slightly less degree, Gert Melville. Neither one of these persons is a reader of the Urantia book. And I think your point about the fact that they probably would have come up with slightly different expressions if they had been is a valid point. They are respected historians who have studied the phenomena associated with monasticism during the Middle Ages, and I think they both of them are doing a credible job of trying to be as objective as possible. Now, your broader point about the fact that this is interesting information that has survived, and that some of the physical evidence has survived in Europe, is a very important point. I frankly was not aware of this phenomenon until I began studying the period. And I take your point also that we are looking at a precursor of individual religion, personal religion, that then will go through various gyrations in the Protestant Reformation, but not exactly, because the Protestant reformers were still telling their believers to follow their own views, namely the views of the reformers, rather than to construct their own relationship with God. So did you want to follow that, or are you content to go on perhaps to the reading about Hildegard and so on?
No, that's fine. Doreen's hand was raised there. I think she went, oh, there it is. It's on the screen.
Oh, yes. Okay, Doreen.
Noticed it.
Actually, I was just going to talk about that. I found what I was looking for about famous women in the Middle Ages, and it talked about Hildegard and many others. But it said that, because I didn't know where she got her education, but it said that Hildegard was a theologian and a writer. She also wrote about medicine, and she wrote music and play and blah, blah, blah. And it said there was another, Trotta of Salerno, 1100, a famous doctor in Italy, and she was famous for its medical school. Women were allowed to study there. And another one was also a famous doctor, and they go on. And there was a lot of women at this period of time in the 1100s that actually, they talked about Marie de France in the 12th century, was a famous, but there were so many known people that contributed to the society. Julian of Norwich was a famous mystic and writer. Julian was a woman's name, wrote about the motherhood of God. Another one, Pizan, was another famous woman, writer in the Middle Ages. But the reason why they're saying this is that women were very important at this period of time. The men could not, and I'm not talking about the bigwinages, but they're talking about in life, in domestic life. They were helping their husbands. They couldn't run their farms without their wives. Their businesses, everything you needed help, and you use your family. And it said, usually women, I guess, were doing the spinning of the wool and the cooking and the cleaning, and washing clothes. They baked, they did all these other things. But this is wonderful to see the educated women that contributed highly to society at this time. And I thought, yes, they had the opportunity in different countries, of course, to go to school and learn. And they were good at it.
Thank you. I think if I have to respond in general, it is beyond our ability and the scope of our discussion to look into the entire realm of contributions of notable women during the Middle Ages. We simply do not have enough time or energy to do that. But I take your point that there were many contributions that we are not going to be able to discuss, and that is a valid point. Francois, would you be willing to read the material at the bottom of the page that starts with extraordinary achievements? Actually, I will read the introductory material, and then I ask you to fill in with the paragraphs from Wikipedia that follow. Extraordinary achievements. From intellectual and cultural perspectives, the 12th century abbess Hildegard of Bingen, 1098 to 1171, whom we previously encountered as an advocate of class consciousness and social discrimination, appears to have been the most distinguished woman who lived in a convent during the entire Middle Ages. In the first two paragraphs of the Wikipedia article about her, she is described as follows.
A German Benedictine abbess, writer, composer, philosopher, Christian mystic, visionary, and polymath. She is one of the best-known composers of sacred monophony, as well as the most recorded in modern history. She has been considered by many in Europe to be the founder of scientific natural history in Germany. Hildegard's fellow nuns elected her as magistra in 1136. She founded the monasteries of Rupertsberg in 1150 and Ebingen in 1165. She wrote theological, botanical, and medicinal texts, as well as letters, liturgical songs for women chores to sing, and poems, while supervising miniature illuminations in the Rupertsberg manuscript of her first work, Civias. There are more surviving chants by Hildegard than by any other composer from the entire Middle Ages. And she is one of the few known composers to have written both the music and the words.
Thank you. I think, frankly, that we will largely have to content ourselves with this description. I would simply add that chants of hers, music that she wrote, are indeed available. If you would like to find Music of Hildegard, you can do that. You can just look it up under Amazon or perhaps other parts of the internet. All of her works, of course, were written in Latin. Bob, could you go on to the next page? I would like to go through this material about Hroswitha of Gandersheim, and I will read the heading material. And if I ask you, please, to read the excerpt from Wikipedia that follows. In addition, the historian Paul Collins calls attention to Hroswitha of Gandersheim, 935 to 1001, stating that she was an aristocratic Saxon and was part of an intellectual renaissance that flowered during the reigns of the three Ottos. The corresponding article in Wikipedia provides more detailed information, describing her as follows.
A German secular canonist who wrote dramas and poems during the rule of the Ottonian dynasty, Hroswitha lived at Gandersheim Abbey. She is considered the first female writer from the German lands, the first female historian, the first person since antiquity to write dramas in the Latin West, and the first female poetess in Germany. Hroswitha's 6 short dramas are considered to be her most important works. She is one of the few women who wrote about her life during the early Middle Ages, making her one of the only people to record a history of women in that era from a woman's perspective. She has been called the most remarkable woman of her time and an important figure in the history of women, from Wikipedia.
Thank you. I would now offer the opportunity to anyone who wants to contribute, either about Hildegard or about Hroswitha, or if you prefer, about the generality of brilliance and intellectual originality that these two women displayed, plus the point, in effect, that Doreen expressed earlier, that there were many other women who made notable contributions. Does anyone want to talk about this general?
Yeah, I've got one, Neil. If
Okay.
I could. I'm already up.
Please.
Hroswitha. No, let me go back to Hildegard. I'm sorry. I read so much about Hroswitha, I was just going to say it again. Hildegard is, the description of that is almost immense. If you read that about someone today, of course, knowledge has been exponentially raised since this time. In paper 114, in the Revelation, we are told about the Reserve Corps of Destiny, and we're told about the Cosmic Reserve Corps of Destiny. The Cosmic Reserve Corps know who they are. Well, I'm not saying that I know, or I would even hypothesize that this individual was a reservist, but and we're told that that the reservists are rarely emblazoned the pages of history. So it would lead us to say, well, she's probably not, because she's on history here. But I don't know. I just brought those two things up to say that here's an individual that I can't imagine any male yet that has done this at the wide. Talk about a polymath. She was like polymath squared. So that's it. First time I read that, I didn't pick all that up, but when Francois, when you read that, it just leapt out at me, and I thought, my gosh, it's kind of nice to speculate about that, because they tell us about both of those reserve corps, and that's one part of our revelation that I think we're allowed to speculate a little bit.
Well, thank you. I would certainly concur with you that this was definitely a remarkable person. She lived almost 1,000 years ago and has left so many traces of her life and activity that it is indeed difficult for us who are looking at this very generally to be able to appreciate the huge dimensions of her activity. Does anyone else wish to comment?
Yes, excuse me, just a short remark to say that these women are famous because they left something, because they were writers and musicians, and they left something. So we know them today. But I'm sure there was a lot of talentuous person that left nothing, so we don't know about them. And mainly it was men writers for these times, but there were exceptions.
Well, thank you, Francois. I'm motivated to ask you about the scribbles of a doctor writing a prescription and whether the pharmacist can read it or not. It certainly would not be memorable or something that would last for 1,000 years. Gary, up to you.
Okay. Yes, just going on from what Bob said and looking at Wikipedia, it says from Hildegard, from my early childhood, before my bones and nerves and veins were fully strengthened, I have always seen the vision of in my soul, even to the present time when I am more than 70 years old. In this vision, my soul, as God would have it, rises up high into the vaults of heaven and into the changing sky and spreads itself among the different peoples, although they are far away from me in distant lands and places. So, you know, from a very early age, there was something very special about this lady, and it's amazing. I don't think there's quite a lot of people still know about it today. And if she did happen today, then she would have so many accolades. It would be incredible. Thank you.
Thank you, Doreen. Yes, Bob, you can shift back to speaker view, please, and remove the material from the screen.
Yeah, I just have one more woman to mention, and that was a very notable woman in the 9th century. Her name was Cassia. She was a poet. And she went to a monastery after she had written a lot of poetry. It said she wrote religious poems there and the music to accompany them, several of which are still used in the Orthodox Church services today. So there you go. Isn't that wonderful to have major mark in history, you know, all these centuries later? Anyway, that's wonderful.
Thank you. Lady and gentlemen, I have to say lady because there's only one of you, Doreen. I think we've had a very interesting discussion. It is clear that the beginnings and the beginnages represented a very advanced idea of spirituality on the part of women, and that they were serving people around them, not just intoning prayers inside a chapel in some isolated location. So we can associate that with the general trend toward personal religion, although of course the history did not quite permit their inclinations to persist in all detail, but nevertheless, I believe, and I think all of you have agreed, that they represented a very positive forward movement, and they certainly honored the inspirations and the initiative of women believers at the time. So thank you very much. The next webinar, which we have not yet scheduled, will certainly begin with formal question 18 on page 32, and we'll go on from there. The questions are very interesting, perhaps rather difficult to decide upon, but I believe we will be eventually able to have a very interesting discussion of these formal questions. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Everybody, be well and stay safe.
Indeed, you do.
Okay.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.